There is a pattern that hides in plain sight. It does not announce itself. It does not appear as a problem. In fact, it often disguises itself as progress. The more a person tries to improve their life, the more something begins to feel quietly misaligned. Not broken, not collapsing, just off. Consider someone who has done everything right. They wake up early, they follow discipline, they read, reflect, optimize, their days are structured, their habits are intentional. From the outside, it appears as control, a life moving forward. But internally, something lingers beneath the surface, a subtle emptiness, difficult to explain, even more difficult to confront, because nothing is visibly wrong, and yet the feeling remains. So they respond the only way they know how, by trying harder. Another routine, another framework, another attempt to refine themselves into something better. But with each attempt, the distance grows, not from success, but from themselves. What begins as improvement slowly transforms into something else, a constant adjustment of identity, a quiet resistance to what already exists. It is no longer about growth. It becomes a process of correction, fixing, editing, replacing, until the original self becomes difficult to recognize. And still, the effort continues, because stopping would mean facing something far more uncomfortable. The possibility that nothing is actually improving, only changing shape. This is where the tension begins, not in failure, but in effort. Because effort assumes a direction. It assumes that somewhere ahead, there is a version of you that is finally enough. But what if that version does not exist? What if the act of trying to become better is the very thing preventing you from feeling whole? The question is subtle, almost easy to ignore. But once it appears, it does not leave. What if everything you are doing to improve your life is quietly making it worse? There is a quiet expectation embedded within modern life. To exist is no longer sufficient. You are expected to evolve, constantly. Every moment becomes an opportunity for refinement. Every flaw, a problem to be solved. Books promise transformation. Routines promise control. Discipline promises identity. And so, the individual begins to organize their life around a single idea. Becoming better. It appears rational, even admirable. There is structure, there is intention, there is visible effort. Time is no longer wasted. Habits are no longer random. Everything is aligned toward improvement. From the outside, it resembles progress. But internally, something more subtle begins to form. A quiet dissatisfaction. Not loud enough to disrupt the process, but persistent enough to never fully disappear. Because beneath every act of improvement lies an unspoken premise that who you are right now is not enough. This premise does not need to be acknowledged. It is absorbed, repeated through action rather than words. Each routine reinforces it. Each attempt to optimize confirms it. And over time, the individual begins to relate to themselves not as a presence, but as a project. Something to be worked on, something to be upgraded. The present self becomes temporary, a placeholder for something more complete. But that something is never clearly defined. It always exists just ahead, just out of reach. And so, the process continues, not because it resolves the tension, but because it sustains it. What appears as discipline begins to carry a different weight, not just effort, but quiet resistance. Resistance to stillness, resistance to acceptance. The contradiction slowly takes shape. Why does the pursuit of becoming better so often feel like a subtle form of dissatisfaction? And more importantly, why does it never seem to? Beneath the surface of improvement, something more complex begins to take shape. It is rarely acknowledged, often misunderstood, but it is always present. The desire to improve does not begin with acceptance. It begins with discomfort, a quiet unease with what already exists. The individual looks inward, And instead of seeing a complete identity, they see fragments, traits to eliminate, weaknesses to correct, impulses to control. What is labeled as growth often carries an unspoken intention to remove parts of the self that feel unacceptable. But what is rejected does not disappear, it withdraws into the unconscious. This is where the internal division begins. The mind constructs an ideal version of who it should be: disciplined, focused, composed. And everything that does not align with that image is pushed aside, suppressed, ignored, dismissed. Yet, as suggested in the work of Carl Jung, these rejected elements do not dissolve. They gather in what he described as the shadow, the hidden dimension of the personality that contains everything one refuses to confront. And the more aggressively a person tries to improve themselves, the more forcefully the shadow resists, not directly, but through subtle disruptions, a sudden loss of motivation, unexplained emotional tension, a persistent sense of disconnection from one's own actions. The individual begins to feel divided, one part striving for control, another quietly pulling in the opposite direction. And this division is not accidental. It is the result of an internal conflict between what is accepted and what is denied. Improvement in this context becomes something else entirely, not a movement toward wholeness, but a movement away from it. Because to fix oneself without understanding oneself is to build identity on partial awareness. And over time, that partial awareness fragments. The more one tries to become a certain version of themselves, the less they recognize what remains beneath it. What appears as progress from the outside begins to feel like distance from within. Not distance from failure, but distance from the self that was never fully acknowledged to begin with. As the internal conflict deepens, another layer begins to reveal itself, one that is less visible, but far more decisive. The ego does not seek resolution, it seeks continuity. It requires movement, a sense of direction, of becoming, of unfolding into something more. And nothing sustains this movement more effectively than the belief that you are not yet enough. This belief is rarely questioned. It feels natural, even necessary, because without it, the structure of striving begins to collapse. If there is nothing left to improve, nothing left to fix, nothing left to become, then what remains? A kind of stillness that the ego cannot easily tolerate. This is where the paradox takes form. The pursuit of improvement appears to be an attempt to reduce dissatisfaction, but in practice, it often preserves it, because dissatisfaction fuels movement, and movement sustains identity. Philosophically, this tension echoes in the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, who explored the idea that human beings are not defined by what they are, but by what they strive toward. The self is not static. It is a process, a constant act of becoming. But within this process lies a subtle trap. Because if your identity is built on becoming, then arrival becomes a threat. Completion becomes dangerous, because it removes the very tension that gives the ego its structure. And so, the system adapts, the goalpost moves. What once felt like progress becomes insufficient. New standards emerge, new ideals take shape. The sense of not being enough is never resolved, only refined. This is not failure, it is function. The ego does not want to end the cycle, it wants to sustain it, because as long as you are in the process of becoming, you never have to confront the absence of it. And so, improvement continues, not as a path to wholeness, but as a mechanism to avoid it, a quiet preservation of incompleteness, not by accident, but by necessity. Progress, as it is commonly understood, depends on measurement, visible change, quantifiable outcomes, a sense that something has been gained, more discipline, more knowledge, more control. These markers create the impression of forward movement, and in many ways, they are convincing, because they can be tracked, compared, improved upon. But not all movement is meaningful. Some movement is only structured repetition, refined, organized, justified. The individual becomes fluent in the language of progress, but increasingly distant from its substance, because what is being measured is not always what is being transformed. There is a subtle shift that often goes unnoticed. The focus moves away from understanding the self toward modifying it, adjusting behavior, correcting patterns, optimizing reactions. But beneath these adjustments, something remains untouched, a quiet sense of disconnection, not from the world, but from one's own internal reality. Existential thought has long suggested that authenticity is not something constructed, it is something revealed. But revelation requires confrontation, and confrontation requires stillness. Yet, constant self-improvement leaves little room for either, because it replaces introspection with action. And action, no matter how productive, can serve as a form of avoidance. The individual continues to move, continues to refine, continues to progress, but the direction becomes uncertain. Is this movement bringing them closer to themselves or further away? The question is difficult to answer because the structure of progress creates its own justification. It feels right, it looks right, but internally something does not align. And that misalignment is easy to ignore as long as the movement continues. At some point, the structure begins to lose its clarity. What once felt purposeful starts to feel rehearsed. The routines remain, the effort continues, the intention appears unchanged, but something beneath it begins to shift. A quiet realization forms, not sudden, not dramatic, but difficult to ignore. What if improvement was never the true objective? What if all of this effort was directed elsewhere? Because to improve suggests movement towards something better. But what if the movement itself was the goal? Not progress, but distance. Distance from discomfort, from insecurity, from the unresolved tension that exists beneath the surface. To improve is to focus forward, to stay occupied, to remain in motion. But to confront requires something else entirely: stillness. And stillness reveals what movement conceals: uncertainty, contradiction, aspects of the self that do not fit neatly into systems or frameworks. It is easier to refine behavior than to understand its origin, easier to build discipline than to question what drives it. So the individual continues to improve, not because it resolves anything, but because it prevents confrontation. Effort becomes a form of distraction, structured, productive, socially reinforced, but distraction nonetheless. And in this realization, the narrative begins to collapse. Because if the desire to improve is rooted not in growth, but in avoidance, then everything built upon it becomes unstable. The discipline, the identity, the direction, all of it begins to feel less certain, not false, but misaligned. And the most unsettling part is not that improvement fails, but that it may have never been the intention to succeed. There is a point, subtle, almost imperceptible, where the momentum begins to slow, not because something has been solved, but because something has been seen. The constant movement, the endless refinement, the quiet urgency to become something else. It starts to lose its certainty. Not entirely, not all at once, but enough to create a pause. And in that pause, something unfamiliar emerges. Not clarity, not peace, just stillness. A kind of stillness that does not offer direction, no next step, no improvement to pursue, no version of yourself waiting ahead. For a mind conditioned to move, this stillness is not comforting, it is disorienting, because without the structure of becoming, the question changes. It is no longer, what should I fix? It becomes, what remains if nothing is fixed? And there is no immediate answer, only presence, unfiltered, unmodified, unresolved. The self, without the framework of improvement, does not present itself as complete or incomplete. It simply exists. But this existence feels unfamiliar because it has rarely been observed without interference, without adjustment, without interpretation, without the need to change it. And so, the discomfort deepens, not as anxiety, but as exposure, a direct encounter with what has always been there, but rarely acknowledged without resistance. There is no system to apply here, no method to follow, because any attempt to structure this moment becomes another form of movement, another layer of distance. And distance is what has been quietly maintained all along, through effort, through discipline, through the pursuit of something just beyond reach. But here, in the absence of that pursuit, distance collapses. And what replaces it is not resolution, but proximity. A closeness to oneself that cannot be managed or controlled, only experienced. This is where the tension softens, but does not disappear, because without the illusion of progress, time feels different, less directional, less purposeful, more immediate. There is no sense of getting somewhere, only the awareness of being somewhere, and that awareness carries its own weight, because it removes the narrative that once justified everything, the idea that all effort was leading somewhere meaningful. That improvement would eventually resolve the underlying discomfort. But now, that resolution feels uncertain. Perhaps it was never meant to arrive. Perhaps the movement itself was the function, not to complete the self, but to avoid encountering it. And now, without that movement, the encounter remains. Unstructured, undefined. There is nothing to hold on to here. No identity built on progress. No reassurance in direction. Only a quiet recognition that the need to become may have been masking something deeper. Not a flaw, not a failure, but a discomfort with simply being. And without that need, without that constant forward pull, something else begins to take shape. Not an answer, not a conclusion, just a lingering awareness that remains unresolved. That maybe nothing was ever broken, and nothing was waiting to be fixed, but also, nothing arrives to confirm that. The silence offers no validation, no certainty, only space. And within that space, the mind searches, not for improvement, but for something familiar to hold on to. Yet nothing presents itself in the same way, because what once defined the experience, the constant movement toward becoming, has quietly stepped aside, leaving behind something far less structured, something far less predictable, something that does not guide, but simply remains. And in that presence, the question does not disappear, it deepens. If there is nothing left to improve, nothing left to chase, then what exactly have you been moving away from this entire time? The answer does not arrive. It lingers, unfinished, unresolved, and perhaps that is where it was always leading.